Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. I wanted to do something on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency again, since that's one of my favorite topics and there are many interesting debates within the existing schools of thought as well. So today's lecture will be on the two schools of classical counterinsurgency. This is a major part of Western military theory. From a non-Western perspective, you could argue that there are other distinctions as well, but contemporary military thinking taught all over the world tends to be Western centric military thinking anyway. So, no matter where you are, it's still an interesting thing to know about. I'm not going to go into the definition of insurgency since it's a cliche at this point and different people use the word in different contexts. A simple definition for our purposes would be an armed rebellion against a recognized authority of some sort, usually where they themselves exercise control over a piece of land. Usually we see many insurgencies all over the world. In fact, in today's world, it's the most common type of armed conflict. We don't really see what's called conventional warfare other than very minor exceptions. Most of it is unconventional in nature, as I've mentioned in one of my previous videos, and insurgencies are a raging example of that. Counterinsurgency, therefore, is the act of fighting an insurgency, something which requires a completely different type of thinking and outlook from fighting a regular conventional war. And here, with counterinsurgency, we tend to see two dominant ways of thinking, two dominant schools of thought: the population-centric approach and the enemy-centric approach. The former believes that counterinsurgency is primarily a matter of being able to control the population, of administration. Here the primary focus is on the people themselves and getting them to do as you need. The latter approach, the enemy-centric approach, believes that eliminating the enemy is the topmost priority, that the population is important as well, but that our primary concern is on defeating the enemy. If we were to apply these in sort of along broadly international lines, you could say that most Western countries today focus on the population-centric approach. If you look at American involvement in Iraq or Afghanistan, for instance, there's an enormous focus on building infrastructure, trying to win over the local population, trying to abide by some standard of human rights even when they wage war, at least on the surface. Whether they actually do protect human rights in all cases is certainly a question mark, but there's no doubt that the American army does focus on that commitment far more than any other army in the world, if nothing else. The prevalent doctrine in US military thinking at the moment is a classic case of a population-centric approach. They call it the hearts and minds approach, where they say, look, the enemy is an ever-replicating, invisible one that will keep sending us an endless stream of ideological foot soldiers if we simply try to fight them with force, if we simply try to kill them all. What we need to do instead is win over the hearts and minds of the local population. That's the only way we can win this war and bring about stability in this region. So while they do fight the enemy as well, on a big picture strategic level, they do believe that winning over the population is the most important objective. In the Eastern Hemisphere, though, the primary model of counterinsurgency is certainly enemy-centric warfare. In this part of the world, insurgencies are actually quite often conclusively ended when that approach is taken. Unlike the Western doctrine, where neither in Iraq nor in Afghanistan have they been successful in eliminating the insurgency even after nearly 20 years of non-stop fighting, the East has a different history. Even if we look at a narrow region like South Asia, India has successfully ended the Khalistan insurgency. Sri Lanka has ended the LTT and JVP insurgencies. Even Pakistan, which still has many insurgency problems, has managed to bring back stability to many areas by waging enemy-centric warfare. The problem with this approach clearly is the human rights aspect, because enemy-centric warfare can often be very costly in terms of civilian life because it's an offensive approach. But statistically, they have a much higher chance of working. Population-centric warfare in its modern hearts and minds approach, unfortunately, seems to be failing to work. It's unfortunate but true. Balancing counterinsurgency with human rights is essentially a concept that sounds great on paper, but impossible to implement in practice and seems to be leading to failure. And this is exacerbated even more by the fact that these hearts and minds armies are usually foreign armies in a foreign land, which makes it even harder for them to become popular with the local people. So, for instance, if India wanted to wage population centric warfare against the Maoist insurgencies in the northeast, it would be very easy for them to win legitimacy among the local population because it's an insurgency happening inside India's borders. So they just need to provide stability and a better life for the locals to see. So for the locals to kind of see themselves as far superior to the insurgents. But if the Americans wanted to do that in Baghdad, it would be far more difficult for them because they're a completely foreign power from a land on the other side of the world. So trying to win over their support, the locals, that becomes extra hard, which makes their population-centric style of counterinsurgency even more untenable. There have been occasionally successful practitioners of it, like the French David Galula, but nothing on a large scale. So ultimately, I would say, tell me where you guys stand. What do you believe would be the best policy if you were in the shoes of a government? Let's say you were the ruler of a country and you faced an insurgency. Do you think you would go for population-centric approach or an enemy-centric approach? As in, would you go in for a more humanitarian, compassionate, multifaceted sort of approach of state building and democracy and winning over the public? Or would you say, look, we can worry about human rights once the fighting is over, that we need to end the conflict as soon as possible, and then we can start focusing on the population? Because some people say that if we do what the terrorists do, we are no better than them. And some people say that if we are to defeat the terrorists, we've got to give them a taste of their own medicine. So which one are you? If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.